Good morning, students. Welcome to this contact class for Educational Foundations. I'm Ms. Isabel Besaidenhout, and I'm your tutor for this subject. Okay, without further ado, let's start and have a look at Unit 1, which deals with comparative education. I just want to say before I continue that you'll see throughout this presentation some words are underlined. Those are the words which I suggest you use your dictionary for and make sure that you know the meaning of all the words, because one of the problems or challenges I can say with this subject is that it deals with a lot of complicated terminology and concepts, which makes it very necessary that you make sure that you actually understand each of them, because it will only be possible to remember and really understand if you use your dictionary to clarify these terms. Okay, so let's have a look. What is comparative education? It is the comparative study of educational theories and practices in various countries. Okay, and then we ask ourselves the question, why is it important? It's important because it attempts to use cross-national data and test propositions about the relationship between education and society, as well as between teaching practices and learning outcomes. Then we also know that policies are influenced by considering the implication of comparative studies. There are different fields that contribute to comparative education, for instance, different fields of the government, management, sociology, technology, as well as communications. It's very meaningful to consider these disciplines when studying comparative education, and it's important to note that these disciplines may affect educational research as well as policy decisions. It's important to develop comparative teaching education as a subject for the following reasons. Educators can consider the insights from other parts of the world when setting standards and procedures to select, educate, and sanction teachers. It also promotes mutual respect and understanding among people of our independent world. More particularly, it enables us to learn about life in other societies, as well as education at all school levels in developed and in developing nations. It helps us to study the what, the how, and the why of teacher education in different social settings, and allows us to develop a broader view of the profession. It's also used to gather a variety of strategies and data, and it ensures the accuracy and comparative nature of teachers' knowledge. Now let's have a look at how history can lay the foundation for genuine citizenship. And as you can see, it all has to do with how we look at the past, not just at the educational philosophies, but also at history in general and how it influences the life we live today. Okay, if we look at history, it provides us with data about the emergence of national institutions, problems, and value. If we think about it, it's the only significant source of data that's available to us. It offers us evidence about how nations have interacted with other societies, and it also provides international and comparative perspectives that are essential for responsible citizenship. It helps us understand how recent, current, and prospective changes that affect the lives of citizens emerge and what causes are involved. Lastly, it also encourages habits of mind that are very important for responsible public behavior. Sorry, let us take that out. Okay. Furthermore, the past causes the present, and saying that it also determines the future in many cases. We have to look for factors that took shape earlier. If we want to explain any major developments, we need to look further back to identify the causes of change. Through studying history, we are able to grasp how things change, and we begin to understand the factors that cause change, and also understand what elements of an institution or a society persist despite change. History also provides us with extensive materials that are available to study the human condition, and it focuses the attention on the complex or difficult processes of social change and the factors causing change. Furthermore, it also provides us with a terrain for moral contemplation. So that means that it allows us to test our own moral sense against some of the real complexities faced in difficult settings. We look at people who might have weathered adversity in real life, and they can provide us with inspiration. History teaching by example. In other words, it describes the use of the study of the past. And then, as such, is not a study of heroes only, but the great men and women of history who successfully worked through moral dilemmas, and also ordinary people who provide us with lessons in courage, diligence, and constructive protest. History can also help us to look at the current data and help us to evaluate the situation that we potentially can be in. In other words, in times of peace, for instance, we can evaluate historical materials that teach us about why wars, for instance, occurred in the past. It helps us understand genius, the influence of technological innovation, and also the roles that beliefs play in shaping our lives. History may also help us understand and formulate laws or theories about human behavior based on historical information. The major aspects of a society's operation, like mass elections, missionary activities, or military alliances, cannot be set up as precise experiments. So as such, history is actually our laboratory. We use the data from the past to figure out why our complex species behaves as it does in social settings. It also is the only evidential base for the contemplation and the analysis of how societies function, and people need to have some sense of how societies function simply to run their own lives. This brings us to Unit 2. Unit 2 deals with the educational thinkers and what role they played in the history of education. The first educational thinker that we focus on is Plato, and especially his conceptualization of the differing educational requirements that is associated with various life stages. Now, if you read through what Plato believed, you will see that he believed in the classical concern for body and mind and the importance of exercise, discipline, storytelling, and games. Then he divided a person's life into different stages, and in each stage there was something important to be learned. For instance, at 6, children would enter school, learn to read, write, and count, and also engage in music and sports. Then when they were 18, they would do military training and physical training. At 21, they would enter higher studies, and at 30, they would study philosophy and serve in the polis, either in the army or in the civil service. And this educational path would then end at 50. The next philosopher is Jomo Kenyata. He was the first prime minister and later the first president of Kenya, and he had adopted a very important concept, Harambee, which was there to pull the country together to build a new nation on. It strongly encouraged communities to work together to raise funds for all sorts of local projects, and pledging that the government would provide them with start-up costs. He was a very important first figure in Kenya's history and someone that they will always cherish as a renowned leader. He had a lot of vision, initiative, and guidance, and he gave his people a true belief in the future of their country, as he instilled in them a desire for freedom and independence. He was a man of numerous talents, charming and articulate, and a great politician. He was also a capable scholar, journalist, teacher, biographer, and conservationist, and as such the father figure that Kenya needed. His spirit still lives on today, and his beliefs are still an inspiration. The Kenyans are a proud people who show their culture and heritage to all who visit them. As Kenyata taught them, they had to be able to live in the light to live. And from his treatment of outsiders and willingness to work with them, they accomplished great things for Kenya. Kenyans, young and old, will never forget Jomo Kenyata, who brought them out of the darkness and into the light. For many of them, he is viewed as their savior. Next, we come to one of our European educational thinkers, John Dewey, and with him I would like you to focus on the school's role of helping in the transformation to a better social order. John Dewey recognized the nature of class barriers and distinctions, and he argued that schools should help in their elimination. According to him, the school had a role in the enhancement of social life in general, and the evils of capitalism in particular. It should not include the teaching of any kind of economic or socialism. Instead, he believed that there should be a study of an active engagement in basic social activities, or we can say occupations, such as growing food, cooking, building a shelter, making clothing, creating stories and artwork, and that children could be best initiated into moral social membership by doing this. So, in other words, we can see that he focuses on the school's role of helping in the transformation to a better social order. By doing this, they would be provided with opportunities to learn the instrument of effective self-direction and also a sensitivity towards social issues and the ability to act on them. The classroom should be as such that it embraced the kind of democratic community life. It should have a concern for human dignity and scientific intelligence that was sought outside the school. For him, the means were in fact the ends. The next person we want to look at is William Spady, and for him, I think it's particularly important to focus on outcome-based education and what it meant to Spady. Outcome-based education is a means of organizing for results. So we base what we do instructionally on the outcomes we want to achieve. So an OBE practitioner will first determine the knowledge, the competencies, and the qualities they want the student to demonstrate when they finish school, and then they will design the curricula and the instructional system that they believe will produce this exit outcome. So it's not a program as such, but a way of designing, developing, delivering, and documenting instruction in terms of its intended goals. Then we come to another African educational philosopher, very well-known person, Julius Nyerere, and he believed that there were two types of educators. One was a generalist, and that type of educator was not politically neutral, but could affect how people look at society and how they seek to use and change it. And then there were also specialists, but they were more concerned with health, agriculture, childcare, management, and literacy. He also said that there were two functions of adult education, which was it should inspire a desire for change and also understanding that change is possible. And secondly, that it should help people to make their own decisions and implement those decisions. So there's a lot more that you can read about Julius Nyerere, and I would like you to do that, but in general, it would be good if you focus on these aspects. Okay, when we come to Unit 3, we're now particularly focusing on early childhood education as well as what are the rights of the child. Now, the definition for early childhood education is that it is the care and instruction of young children outside the home. And what makes it unique is that it starts with the child and not with the subject matter. There's one very important principle that overshadows the different approaches to preschool education, and that is that early childhood curriculum and practice must be adapted to the maturing needs, abilities, and the interests of the child. Then we also have a look at the 4 core principles of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which is it's the devotion to the best interest of the child. Secondly, that they have a right to life and survival. and development, and then also that there should be respect for the views of the child. Next of all, also part of this unit, we focus on the fact that education can create an effective conceptual framework based on equal rights and the best interests of the child. So, schools should adapt to the children rather than to reject those that are difficult to educate. The educational policies, the school curricula, the teaching materials, or any program should reflect and be developed in accordance with human rights principles. And the human rights concepts and values should be an integral part of all processes of education. Okay. Furthermore, any training or educational program needs to be consistent with human rights principles, and it should provide knowledge and information on how human rights, let me just repeat that. To be consistent with human rights principles should provide knowledge and information on and about human rights, and it should also seek to develop attitudes and behavior respectful of those rights. It should include the development of basic skills as well, such as critical thinking, communication skills, etc. Everything that is essential to the implementation of human rights standards. Children should be encouraged to learn through observation rather than exhortation. Thus, the recognition of their rights in education will greatly facilitate human rights education. Now, we know that in Namibia, in many countries in the world still, there are many children that remain excluded from schooling, and it's important that we also consider some of the possible reasons. There might be more than the ones named here, but some of the reasons are that they may be indigenous, they may be refugees, or perhaps they don't have identity papers. In many countries, because children are not citizens, they don't have a legal right to education. And then very much a problem is also the child with disability, with a disability which may be excluded from school. Even if the law prescribes that schooling should be there aren't always the necessary buildings, or they don't always have access to special schools. There might be no trained staff, or the environment might not be very welcoming. Okay, another important aspect we concentrate on is gender equity, and gender equity specifically regarding education. Often education as a single sector does not generate sufficiently attractive incentives for the girls' parents. So that means it might not be worth it, if I can put it like that, for parents to send their girls to, or their daughters to school. How strange it may ever sound. Even if they are educated, on the other hand, sometimes they cannot apply their learning to sustain themselves and or to help their parents. Schooling may appear to have no benefit when women do not have access to employment, or if they are precluded from becoming self-employed or do not have a choice as to whether to marry or to bear children. And many times we also see that they still do not have opportunities for political representation. So all of these are factors that sometimes make it very difficult for females to get educated and even have access to tertiary studies and equal rights. That brings us to Unit 4. Unit 4 deals with colonialism in Namibia and specifically what the effects were on the Namibian people regarding education. When we look at the South African colonial education, a name that stands out is H.F. Verwoerd, who was the father of apartheid. He is seen as the leading architect of apartheid, and he declared that education would always be separate and unequal, and that was basically designed so that Africans would only develop within their own communities and of course only develop limited skills and abilities. The principles that underlie this philosophy was geared to ensure that every nation would guard their own identity, that every child would be educated in their mother tongue, and that there would be a very strong national and cultural identity in South Africa, and at that stage also Namibia. Then Namibia also dealt with German colonialism, and it was used as an instrument of oppression when people were educated during this time, because the apartheid rules were still valid. The schools were only built for whites mainly, and the Germans, in fact, never actually came to grips with the objective of education for the Africans. They did, however, ensure that there was a kind of a training, but it was only to serve the needs of the masters. So it was a source for servants and laborers, and it was designed to keep them inferior and also to avoid that they ever entertain any ideas of democracy and human freedom. What we see is in 1909, they introduced education for the white population, but very little changed for the indigenous population. They didn't see it as necessary for the country's economic development. That's why they did not provide the indigenous population with any education. And the missionaries as well also did not wish to risk giving the indigenous population education, because, as I said, that might have resulted in teaching them about ideas like democracy and equality. But what the missionaries did do is they wanted to establish Christian communities, so they at least taught the African people to read and write. There were some primary schools, but only in small, scattered communities by the late 19th century. So what challenges and problems do we deal with today because of the history of Namibian education? There are quite a few important problems that we need to focus on, and the first one is that our country still isn't able to provide adequate skilled human resources, and that we still have a lot of employment and underemployment. Secondly, the levels of expenditure in education is not sustainable in the long run, and the government is forever dealing with increasing budget deficits. In the third place, there is the need to improve the conditions for teaching and learning, especially as we know in our rural areas, and they're focusing on the quality of instruction in mathematics, science, and English. Furthermore, the ministry is still in the process of organizing and strengthening advisory service structures in all of the regions. So things are not in place at this stage. In the fifth place, some of the policies still need to be implemented to make sure that there's education for all. In the sixth place, we really have a challenge when we try to reach out to the educationally marginalized, the impoverished, and those people who live in the very remote areas of Namibia. There's more. Then we come to the fact that a lot of people are really affected by HIV and AIDS. It has led to many deaths, particularly among our young, productive people. Previously, not as such at the moment, there was also an influx of refugees, and Namibia then had the challenge of also providing quality education to these children and adults. Then we see that children with severe learning difficulties still do not have access to schools. We have very, very few special schools where these people can be trained and educated. In the 10th place there, we see that the government's task of decentralizing functions to regions, the high unemployment rate, particularly among our youth, coupled with the inadequate financial resources available to address these issues, make quality education for all a huge problem in Namibia. Okay, now we're going to focus on women again. What effect did the pre-independent education specifically have on our women in Namibia? We see that the combination of unequal provision, the neglect and the discrimination in education of females in the pre-independent Namibia set the stage for a predominantly illiterate female population in independent Namibia. I think a lot of that has changed, but if we look at it, we must see it as the additional challenges that women had after independence. So we see that at independence, Namibian women were socially, politically, economically, psychologically, and educationally brutalized, dehumanized, and disempowered. Now that is actually a mouthful, and I would like to invite you to think of each of these concepts and what the real meaning and the real impact of each of those would be on women. Okay, now what we deal with in this century is a new model of learning that came about in the 1980s, and it was known as the global education reform movement. When we say that it's a new paradigm, we just mean that it's a new pattern or a new model of learning. Okay, and what happened from the 1980s and onwards is that there was a cognitive and constructivist approach to learning that gradually shifted the focus of education reforms from teaching to learning. According to this model, the intended outcomes of schooling emphasized greater conceptual understanding, problem solving, emotional and multiple intelligence, as well as interpersonal skills, rather than just remembering facts or mastering irrelevant skills. At the same time, it also focused on the need for proficiency in literacy and numeracy, which has now become a prime target of education reforms. So, why is education for all so important in this new model? There's a public demand that has become stronger and stronger to guarantee effective learning for all pupils. That's why there's so much focus on inclusive education and making arrangements for all students, introducing common learning standards for all in order to promote the ideal of education for all. The accountability movement in education that has accompanied the global wave of decentralization of public services is also of importance. Once again, I want to say here, make sure if you read the word accountability, what does it actually mean? It's important that you do not just memorize these things, but that you are able to paraphrase it in your own words to show that you really have made these concepts part of your understanding and that this will really help you to answer questions more effectively. Okay, so furthermore, if we look at education for all, it focused on making schools and teachers more accountable for their work, which has led to the introduction of education standards, indicators and benchmarks for teaching, and also aligned assessments and testing and prescribed curricula. So we can see that it had a far-reaching effect on every aspect of education. As a result, furthermore, concentrating on accountability, where school performance and raising the quality of education are now closely tied to the processes of accreditation, promotion, and financing. The next topic in this unit that I would like to look at is when we look at primary and pre-primary education, specifically with regard to languages, what relation do we see there? And specifically, let's focus on what do our students learn in the pre-primary years regarding languages. Okay, in pre-primary, your students should be able to listen for information and to respond appropriately. They should also be able to read signs and words from the immediate environment and be able to communicate effectively and confidently in their mother tongue. If the mother tongue is not possible, then usually the language that is spoken most locally is used. Furthermore, a pre-primary learner should be able to express him or herself well orally, read appropriate text, and write reasonably correctly for everyday purposes in their mother tongue or in their locally most spoken language. So, second language learners we know, and we're talking specifically about English, should be able to understand, speak, read, and write English as a second language eventually, well enough within a limited range to continue learning through the medium of English in the next phase. So we see that it starts off with a pre-primary, where they only need to listen for information, respond appropriately, read short signs and words, and then it goes over to primary, where they need to express themselves by reading, writing, and speaking, and that they should be able to understand English well enough so that it can enable them to further their studies. I hope you see the distinction there. It's not that clear on the slide. I think I'll just make a change there to make it clearer. Okay, a very important aspect of our teaching, especially if you're an English teacher, but also any other subject teachers, that you should consider English across the curriculum. English really has a very large role in our Namibian situation because it's our official language and it's also our medium of instruction from grade 4 and upwards. As such, teachers have a very, very big responsibility to improve the learners' oral and oral skills in discussion, reflection, and reporting, as well as their perceptual skills in using different types of reading techniques and materials, and also their written skills. As such, they must be able to write summaries, do note-taking, write different sorts of papers, as well as reports. Teachers have to be aware that because for many or most of our students, English is their second language, they might have very limited English skills, and therefore teachers have to provide them with opportunities to learn and exercise them. The English teacher should be kept informed about the particular needs that the learners may have so that she or he can reinforce these in English. Okay, so what else does English across the curriculum entail? You need to develop the learner's familiarity with and ease in using the terminology of every subject and its discourse. Discourse means the way of talking about the subject matter. As I said, it's a second language for most of our learners. Therefore, the subject teacher has to take time to ensure that the learners understand the vocabulary, the terms and the jargon of the subject, and that they're also able to use them correctly and meaningfully. A lot of attention must be given to explaining the technical terms and also to help the student develop oral and written communication within and about the subject matter, the processes, and the skills. Our next topic is the role that a knowledge-based society plays in the context of globalization. Now, if we have a look, we see that a knowledge-based society takes its place in a context of globalization, where it's important to not only have knowledge and skills, but also to have a strong identity and values as an individual, a culture, and a nation. The concept of knowledge, in other words, embraces indigenous knowledge, local and national culture, as well as international and global culture. If a country or if a nation has a strong cultural and individual identity and positive values, it makes it possible to influence globalization and not to be overwhelmed by it. In our context, this includes a strong collaborative culture, which is characteristic of our African society. We look again at education for all, and this time we focus on why it's important for the development of every country. It's not just a good thing for each individual, but it will be to the benefit of the whole country. Education for all has value both to the individual and the society, as it's a way to civilize the individual and therefore an aim in itself. In classical sociological thoughts, it is needed to shift values from particularism to universalism, achievement, and specificity. That is a change from traditional man to an economic man, seen as fundamental in reaching these goals. If we look at it in modern argumentation, it is seen as part of the universal human rights as demonstrated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is a means for the individual to reach other goals. Furthermore, we see that universal primary education is also part of the UN's Millennium Goals. Children everywhere should be able to complete a full course of primary school, and an important and necessary means to the development is an important necessary means to the development process in any developing country. The identification of lack of education as a bottleneck to development goes back to the early modernization theory, and we can only achieve economic growth if we have an educated population. Therefore, education remains high on all agendas because it's human capital that makes sustainable economic growth possible. And economic growth is dependent on the implementation of new technology. Therefore, education is a necessary means to achieve the aims. Okay, now let's move to the classroom and specifically look at the concept of positive discipline. So what is the definition of positive discipline? It's a method that's focused on the encouragement and on problem solving. It does not use yelling, spanking, or severe punishment. How can it be established? If your class has a supportive atmosphere, if the student experiences work as challenging and meaningful, and when you are organized efficiently with regard to teaching and learning. You need to be punctual as a teacher and make sure that no time is wasted. In other words, you must be well organized, well prepared, and you must make sure that your learners are motivated and on task. Importantly, proper learning will only take place if your learners are free from hunger, illness, tiredness, and fear. We know that those are the basic needs. If those are not met, it's very unlikely that there will be a positive atmosphere in your class. Note that any form of corporal punishment or intimidation, whether physical or psychological, is counter to positive discipline. And we also know that this is not allowed in any of our schools. It is against the law. When teaching and learning are well organized and managed and appropriate learner-centered methods are used, positive discipline will definitely ensue. Okay, next topic, titled General Secondary Education and a Sustainable Competitive Economy. Now, the word sustainable means that something is kept at a level where it functions to its maximum. So if we look at sustainable competitiveness, institutions, policies, and factors make a nation productive over the long term while ensuring social and environmental sustainability. It's very important to remember that. In the information age where we live, with the globalization of markets, secondary education is the thing that develops and reinforces the capacity for continuous learning and flexible skill training. With national competitive and international cooperation, we see that it depends on knowledge, skills, and competencies that is associated with abstract reasoning, analysis, language and communication, and also the application of science and technology. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that export-led growth is associated with the investments that education makes in the post-primary levels. Okay, we also need to consider curriculum revision when we consider educational foundations. And many things that happen in society actually influence the way the curriculum is formed. If we look, for instance, at cross-curricular themes, we might work in things like HIV/AIDS and health education, human rights and democracy, etc., when we revise our curricula, depending on what the needs of our society is. At the same time, we eliminate obsolete content and practice it. When something is obsolete, it means it's no longer valid, or it doesn't make sense to have it as part of the curriculum anymore. Another thing which every society will focus on is the acquisition of literacy, numeracy, and life skills, which we emphasize in our lower primary. And then when we look at our secondary level, the emphasis has always been on the localization of the HIGCSE curriculum and to ensure more relevance and local application in the curriculum. So if we change our curriculum, we are also going to change the way that we teach our teachers, how we educate them. Teacher education curricula is revised once the revision for the formal school system has been done and will be aligned and responsive to the needs and the requirements of the school curricula. Something that goes hand in hand with that is how high value is part of a successful economy and how it can be established through education. It's best guaranteed by well-trained and educated personnel and through flexible and lifelong learning opportunities for all citizens. The most frequently presented general idea for increasing economic competitiveness is to equip people with the skills and the attitudes for economic and civic success in an increasingly knowledge-based economy. This is rhetoric typically written into the strategies or policies that address the relation between economic competitiveness and the development of education. So, what is the relation between the economic factors and the education system? The key economic factors that we focus on is labor cost, interest rate, government policy, taxes, management, poverty, employment, national resources, and productivity. And all of these need to be considered with regard to sustainable competitiveness. The institutions, the policies, and the factors make a nation productive over the long term, while at the same time ensuring social and environmental sustainability. Furthermore, national competitiveness and international cooperation depend on knowledge, skills, and competencies that is associated with abstract reasoning, analysis, language, and communication skills. As we said, it suggests that export-led growth is associated with investments at post-primary levels, and also that education for the knowledge-based economy has become a buzz phrase in the education on policy discourse in our developed world. Lastly, we have to look at the fact that it has really been transformed into operational strategies or reform programs for education. Education on reform that is targeted on serving knowledge-based economies emphasize mathematics and science, information and communication, and technologies, basic knowledge and skills in literacy, and also the development of interpersonal skills. We see that if we have a successful knowledge economy, it also requires advanced secondary and tertiary education, as well as the provision able to boost labor productivity, research, and innovation. Last of all, many of the education on reforms is aimed at promoting economic competitiveness, and it takes the form of centrally steered structural and programmatic directives. Really are these changes directly related, however, to what teachers and students are doing in schools and classrooms. And as such, we must remember that successful economies compete on the basis of high value, not only low cost. What is high value? You need to ask yourself that, but we do know that it's best guaranteed by well-trained and educated personnel, and that flexible, lifelong opportunities should be there for all citizens. Other factors that we need to consider when we look at the relation between economic factors and the education system is to increase economic competitiveness, equip people with the skills and attitudes for economic and civic successes in an increasingly knowledge-based economy is very important. So this rhetoric is typically written into strategies or policies that address the relation between economic competitiveness and the development of education. So in the midst of education on reforms, teachers have a difficult question to answer, and that is, what should we do differently in schools in order to contribute effectively to economic competitiveness and growth? So we need to examine what economic competitiveness means if we want to understand what we should do differently in schools. Their governments have a very important role to play, as they have to offer and guarantee good education and adequately emphasize the core determinants of economic competitiveness. Last but not least, it's very difficult to translate the central role of education into concrete activity and programs that will really lead to improved human capital and therefore contribute to the social and economic progress. Okay, our next concept deals with inclusion. Inclusion is something that I think is very much also part of education for all, and it deals with the child's right to participate and the school's duty to accept the child. So inclusion rejects the use of special schools or classrooms to separate students with disabilities from students without disabilities. So the focus is here placed on a student's full participation, whether he has a disability or not, and also that we respect each and every child's social, civil, and educational rights. Inclusion gives students with disabilities skills that they can use inside as well as outside the classroom. Okay, the next part, you'll see, you can go through these on your own, are some images about children's rights and responsibilities. Now, these are not difficult to understand, but what I want to ask you here is really think of the practical implications these have. And if you have to give me examples of, for instance, that a child has right to special care, and if he or she has special needs, the child still has the right to be educated. What does it really imply? I need you to think about that. And then I also want you to be able to explain how the responsibility links with the right that the child has. So for each of these images, as I said, you can go through them and then you ask yourself, what exactly does this right imply and how does this responsibility link with the right that the child has? But also in practical terms, not just regurgitating the fact that you learn, but actually showing your understanding of it. Okay, we're nearing the end of the presentation now. So one of the last things that I want us to focus on is the area of educational psychology and what value they can add to our system. And we see that the biggest thing that they can do, or how they can assist us as teachers and our education system as such, is that they have a lot of valuable information on how we should handle children. They are very influential in the Education for All movement, and they are very strongly represented as well in inclusive education. We said every single child has a right to education, no matter what his or her circumstances or barriers might be. Educational psychologists are focused on how to integrate children with special needs or barriers to learning into our mainstream schools. Then they will also obviously influence the policies and the documentations regarding the school, the teachers' training, and the education in every country that is becoming inclusive. I think, and I actually strongly believe that educational psychologists are needed in every school to help us realize the dream of education for all. Okay, so that was the last important thing that I want you to focus on. I just want to repeat at this stage, please look at all your learning outcomes of this specific subject, educational foundations. Concentrate on clarifying each and every single term. Do not just learn it off by heart. Understand what you are learning. Make summaries, rewrite everything in your own words. Mind maps are a wonderful way to study. Contact me well before the exams if you feel that you are overwhelmed and you're struggling. I will give you guidelines on how to study. What I'm not going to do is to translate, or not translate, but to simplify all the vocabulary for you. As a tertiary student, that is your responsibility, and it's also much more meaningful if you look up words, if you rewrite these concepts and definitions in your own words. You see my contact details are available for you. I prefer that you send me an email or an SMS if you want me to phone you, because I am teaching during the day mostly, up to after 3 in the afternoons many times. But if you send me an SMS or an email, I promise I'll always come back to you, and I will organize a time that both of us are able to speak in a relaxed manner. Thank you for your attention, students, and I wish you all the best for your assignment if you still need to do it, as well as for your coming exams. Thank you.